Now we must be on to aggregate supply. So aggregate supply, we're going to start off the same way we started off with everything as we've moved through these models. We're going to define what we're talking about. Aggregate supply is the various quantities of output or real GDP that collected sellers would be willing or able to supply, manufacture, or produce at various price levels. Now, we must be working toward drawing that, right? The aggregate supply curve illustrates the relationship between the level of prices and the quantity of output supplied. So here we go with drawing that. You might be thinking this is getting easy. Don't get too carried away. What has he done? He's drawn, he didn't say aggregate supply. He drew a vertical line. I was expecting an upward sloping line. Well, we do have an upward sloping line as well. Oops. We have a long run aggregate supply curve and a short run aggregate supply curve. Let's focus our energy here for now. When we're talking about our long run aggregate supply curve, we're talking about really two things we've already talked about. We're talking about having two goods in our economy that we are capable of producing, let's say goods or services with plastic, in their production in the good itself, or a service that uses plastic, compared to goods, services without plastic. And we have production possibilities between these two buckets of goods. And if I've done this as my abstract imagination thinks I have, I've captured everything the economy can do in that production possibilities frontier. Because everything either has plastic or it doesn't have plastic, one or the other. If there's some other way it could be, I'd like to know. So we can choose as an economy which point or bundle to target on this production possibilities curve between these goods that I've come up with. This is without star, and this is with star. So there's a production possibilities curve bundle of goods that we might choose to produce at any given time with the resources we have. And what are the resources we have? Well, that's our production function. Output is a function of labor, capital, natural resources, and human capital, all improved by technology. That's what determines how much we can produce when we talk about our production possibilities curve. That's still how much we can produce as an economy. And it has nothing to do with prices. It's about these resources. So that's what this long run aggregate supply curve, which mine's a little crooked, but it's supposed to be vertical. That's what the long run aggregate supply curve is about, what we can produce as an economy. But there's a short run aggregate supply curve where we might deviate from the productive capabilities of our economy in the short run. And here's one way I can tell you that that's so. Suppose you're offered overtime, double pay for working overtime. Might you work more than you typically would, more than your part-time hours are typically, or if you work full-time, might you work more than 40 hours for double overtime for a while? I would, I do. So what that means is I can work beyond my normal productive capacity for some kind of a tease of higher prices or higher price level, because wages and prices move together. At least that's what I'm trying to illustrate, is that we can deviate from this. You and I would do it as an individual. Why wouldn't we do it as an economy? We could, beyond everything against everything we said about the production possibility curve, we might be able to exceed our production possibilities curve for a while just by working a lot more or a lot harder, but that's a short-term thing, because labor is our number of laborers. Like, we could all work some extra hours a week for a while, but if we're going to get tired of it and want to go back to 40 hours a week after a while as well. So this is still true, but we could still exceed that. What would induce us to do that? Well, higher pay, which is something upward on the price level. So these two both exist, and they both represent aggregate supply. A lot of textbooks, I think Miller only calls this AS and this LRAS. I don't see where it costs that much to add in an extra 2 letters, to be clear. So I call this short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. What then causes these to shift? Because that's how we've handled things everywhere before so far, is we looked at, what was it called? What were we investigating? What did it look like? We drew it, and then we got into the determinants of it, right? The things that cause it to shift. So what causes our supply curve to shift in this model, the aggregate supply curve? Well, you kind of have it already. I know you're thinking, oh no, he's going to go with another list. I have to memorize another list. Well, as I mentioned in the last video, our lists going forward are things that we tend to already be familiar with. So that's some good news, I think. Our determinants of aggregate supply, and I'm just going to call it AS because it's related to both, are, ready for this? Technology, labor, capital, capital. Natural resources. And human capital. We already had those with our production functions. So when one of these increases, that increases long-run aggregate supply. Now, generally, short-run aggregate supply is going to move to the right with it, but it has its own determinants that are closely related. And these are input prices, productivity, and the legal or institutional environment, taxes, subsidies, regulations, or restrictions. So these can affect short-run aggregate supply separate from long-run aggregate supply, but generally, when we're talking about changes in long-run aggregate supply or aggregate supply, what we're talking about is economic growth. And these things economic growth comes from these things that are our production function. So I think you know where we're going to head next. Now that we have defined our curve, drawn our curve, and looked at the things that shift our curve, we must be due to put our curves together. So that's what we're going to do in the next video.